I really have the feeling that Trump and Netanyahu are right now the two most dangerous men on the planet. Donald Trump has, of course, completely deceived his voters. That MAGA base, Make America Great Again. It's a betrayal, and a painful one. What many people are noticing now is that Trump can't solve a problem that didn't even exist before.
Obviously, this war isn't about Iran's nuclear program. So what is it really about?
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person. Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Wir präsentieren
Hello, and welcome to Against the Current. We present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media prefer to keep quiet about. He's a historian and peace researcher. He believes that, as he puts it, the human family won't allow itself to be drawn into new wars. For that, he's been labeled a conspiracy theorist by the warmongers and their academic helpers. I've checked his work myself, using the example of NATO's secret armies back when I was researching intelligence services, and it turned out everything was correct. Hello, Daniele Ganser.
Alles ist richtig. Hallo, Daniele Ganser.
Hi, Patrick. I'm really glad you came by. I really appreciate the work you're doing.
Danke, dass du Zeit für uns findest.
Thanks for taking the time to talk with us. We're on a first-name basis. We've known each other for almost 10 years, and we work closely and gladly together. Danielle, the Chancellor, says Israel is doing the dirty work for us. The American President, Donald Trump, says he'll bomb Iran back to the Stone Age where it belongs. He says he wants to destroy a civilization. That's what he wrote on Truth Social, his channel. What goes through your mind when you hear that?
Was geht da in dir vor, wenn du das hörst?
I'm shocked, like so many others. I mean, I think the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu, is a real danger to world peace. Clearly, he carried out the genocide in the Gaza Strip, and now, together with the American President Trump, he's attacked Iran on February 28th, 2026. And you know, Trump and Netanyahu had already attacked Iran back in June 2025 during the 12-day war. That means there have been two clear violations of international law. And honestly, I would expect a German chancellor, whether it's Merz or whoever happens to be in power, to simply say the United States and Israel have violated international law.
Und Israel haben gegen das Völkerrecht verstoßen. Das ist zu verurteilen. Das sind Angriffskriege.
That deserves condemnation. Those are wars of aggression. But nothing seems harder for the German government than criticizing Israel or the United States. Are they weak? I think so, yes. There's just no principle there. You can't say you condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. So do I, by the way. In my view, that was illegal. But, and I've read your work on this with great interest, your book, On Both Sides of the Front. I mean, there was NATO's eastward expansion. There was the coup in 2014 when Yanukovych was ousted and overthrown. And there were the snipers on the Maidan.
Die Scharfschützen auf dem Maidan. Das heißt, beim russischen Einmarsch in die Ukraine kann man sagen, ist ein
That means, when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can say it's a violation of international law, but it was provoked by NATO's eastward expansion. In this case, with the attack on Iran, I don't see it that way. I think it's really a war of choice, a war that Netanyahu and Trump decided to wage, with very serious and far-reaching consequences. We're all still trying to figure out where this is going. But I think the Europeans, and it's not just that Merz is weak because he doesn't criticize it. We also have Macron, the president of France, who hasn't clearly condemned it either.
Der Präsident von Frankreich hat es nicht klar verurteilt. Auch Keir Starmer, der Premierminister.
Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, hasn't clearly condemned it either. I have to say honestly, the only Europeans showing real courage right now are the Spanish. Pedro Sanchez is the president in Madrid, and he's made two important points. First, he said that on February 28th, 2026, the attack by Israel and the United States on Iran is a violation of international law. And on that, Pedro Sanchez is absolutely right. Second, he said that the United States must not use military bases in Spain to carry out an illegal attack on Iran. In my view, that's simply the only reasonable position.
Vernünftige Position.
Diese restlichen
These remaining European politicians, let me call them that, who are following the United States here. Max Weber might have come to mind, as he put it, the iron cage of servitude. Are these people submissive to the United States?
Den Vereinigten Staaten hörig?
Also irgendwie haben sie einfach keinen Mut. Das ist so
Somehow, they just don't have any courage. That's really the impression I get. You know, for example, we saw how American aircraft in Saudi Arabia were destroyed by Iranian drones. So first, there's this attack by Israel and the United States on Iran. That's already illegal. There's really no need to debate that. Some people told me, well, the government in Iran wasn't great either. They had the death penalty. Personally, I'm against the death penalty. Of course, innocent people were executed in Iran. That's true. But you can't just go and bomb the United States because they also have the death penalty and have executed innocent people. So my basic view is that international law has to come first.
Zuerst ist das Völkerrecht zu achten. Und das besagt eben im Artikel 2,
And Article 2 clearly says this: the members of the United Nations, all 193 states, shall refrain, and that's a direct quote, from any use or threat of force in their international relations. I explain that in detail in my book, Illegal Wars. And that's why I keep saying that should really be the first principle we follow. Now, American military planes landed at Ramstein, then continued on to the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, and from there, they actually took part in the bombing of Iran. Germany should not allow that, if I may put it that way. And on ARD and ZDF, for reasons you probably know better than I do, it's never mentioned that U.S. forces are using German military bases for these illegal wars.
My impression is that what's being broadcast here isn't what interests the viewers, but what the bosses want to hear. Is moralism just another form of opportunism?
I think so, because it would be really interesting for people to finally get a program like that from ARD. Here we have Iran, which was attacked by Trump and by Netanyahu, so you could show that. You could show, these are the American military bases. They're in Iraq, they're in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in the Emirates, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, but they're also in Germany. The most well-known one is Ramstein, but there are many more. Let's just take Ramstein as an example. Then, of course, there are the military bases in Italy, and there are bases in Spain. It would have been good to show people, here's the map, just the facts. These are the military bases, and this is how they were used. But you don't hear that, and you don't see it.
Aber das hört man nicht, das sieht man nicht. Ich recherchiere diese Dinge, ich weiß, dass du diese Dinge recherchierst.
I research these things, and I know you do too, but we're really struggling to get any of it out to the public. Honestly, it's only through YouTube channels that we can even explain this to people. And I really think there's a trend where people are starting to say, why should I still watch public broadcasting if the really interesting things aren't being uncovered there? Even in the US, there's a super dynamic discussion right now, started by the YouTuber Tucker Carlson. He's got 5 million subscribers. And he's saying, look, folks, we need to talk about Netanyahu's influence on Trump. So, it's about Israel's influence on the United States. And that debate is way more interesting than what we're seeing here in our ARD, ORF, or SRF media.
ARD, ORF, SRF Medien.
What you also don't hear mentioned is that the United States maintains around 800 military bases all over the world. And according to a study from Brown University, the U.S. has carried out several hundred regime change operations and wars of aggression since 1945. Why doesn't that ever come up?
Weil eigentlich
Because basically, history classes only go up to 1945. In schools, it's like we cover up to World War II, Hitler was evil, and that's the end of the story. Maybe Hiroshima and Nagasaki get mentioned too. But Iran? That's not taught. The NATO secret army, Gladio? Not taught. The coup against Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran, carried out by MI6 and the CIA? Not taught. Noriega in Panama in 1989? Not taught. Or how Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya in 2011? Also not taught. And that's really the impression you get at high schools in Switzerland, Austria, and Germany. You can teach up to 1945, but if you go beyond that, you'd better make sure to say that NATO is a force for peace.
Die NATO ist eine Kraft für den Frieden. Also weißt du, wenn du dann sozusagen, also ich war jetzt gerade
So when you, well, I was just recently in Austria, and an Austrian history teacher came up to me after a talk and said, "Thank you for your work. I've brought some of it into my classes." And then as we were talking, I said, "Yeah, but that's not always easy, is it?" And he said, "No, I always have to be a bit careful because criticism of US wars can really cause tension in the teacher's lounge or even lead to calls from parents." And I think it's the same at universities. I mean, I know the history seminars pretty well.
Im Geschichtsseminar kenne ich mich ja gut aus. Da darf man dann eigentlich nicht 9/11 hinterfragen.
You're basically not supposed to question 9/11 or the whole war on terror, even though the Cost of War project at Brown University has analyzed it in great detail. Those were unbelievable crimes. There's Guantanamo, where we saw torture. Then Abu Ghraib, again, torture. Then we have wars of aggression, deaths in Iraq, and the lies about weapons of mass destruction. So the evidence is all there. In my view, we really need a critical discussion about US imperialism, because in the end, it's not just about Trump. Joe Biden, his successor, actually fueled the war in Ukraine. He didn't do anything to de-escalate it. And before Biden, we already had Trump.
Und vor Biden hatten wir schon mal Trump. Trump hat damals, das möchte ich vielleicht kurz erwähnen, wenn ich darf.
Trump, back then, let me just mention this briefly, if I may, tried to overthrow the government in Venezuela. Now, he's already removed Maduro from power, but he had tried before. And he also killed Soleimani, an Iranian, a high-ranking Iranian who was in Iraq. Before that, we had Obama. In 2011, Obama overthrew the government in Libya. That was clearly illegal. Before Obama, we had Bush. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, and before Bush, there was Clinton. Clinton bombed Serbia in 1999. So it's a long, long list of US crimes, but that's really not being taught. I think it's a systematic problem in the German education system.
Es ist ein systematisches Problem im deutschen Bildungsraum.
It's striking that, in all these wars, there's been a broad consensus in political Washington. Where does that consensus come from? What is the hegemon trying to achieve?
Vorherrschaft. Der Hegemon will Vorherrschaft.
Dominance. The hegemon wants dominance. Now, an ordinary person, say someone in Switzerland or Germany, might think, okay, I kind of know the United States, right? The capital is Washington, about 330 million people. I know Trump, he's the president. California has nice beaches. Hawaii is part of the US, and there are alligators in Florida. So that's roughly the picture people have of America. But what's really important to understand is this. There are two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Trump belongs to the Republicans, Obama was a Democrat, Bush was a Republican, and Clinton was a Democrat. But what you can clearly see is that when it comes to wars, neither side holds back. Both parties wage wars, the Democrats and the Republicans alike. The American professor Noam Chomsky, whom I once met at MIT in Boston, put it this way: the American voter really only has a choice between two war parties. They can vote for the Republicans, that's one war party, or they can vote for the Democrats, but that's also a war party. And you can see that most clearly, Patrick, when you look at who actually votes to increase the military budget. Because that always has to be approved by Congress. The president can't just say, I'd like this or that military budget.
Das ist die Hoheit der Legislative.
That's the authority of the legislature. And in the United States, the legislature is divided into the Senate with 100 senators and the House of Representatives with 435 members. I explain that in my book, Imperium USA. So these roughly 500 lawmakers, 535 to be exact, are the ones who decide whether to raise the defense or war budget. And both Democrats and Republicans are always on board when it comes to pouring more money into war and armaments. In my view, that's the behavior of an empire whose parliament no longer aims for peace. And the parliament doesn't even ask, what are the real needs of the citizens? Because we're talking about 100 million out of 330 million Americans. 100 million people have no savings. None. That's almost a third of the population. A third of the population. And those people are basically left, how should I put it, somewhere between drugs and homelessness. And then I ask myself, why is Trump attacking Iran? Shouldn't he fix his own country first? He's got so many people who are suffering, he should be focusing on them. But I get the impression it's an oligarchy, meaning rule by the few. Because just running for president costs at least $500 million. Some say $900 million. Either way, that's money you and I don't have. I mean, who has $500 million? So to even become president, you need a lot of big donors. And those 100 million poor people definitely can't give you $1 million. They don't even have 5,000 euros or $5,000. They don't even have 1,000 euros. And that's 100 million people. Because most Europeans, when they think of the United States, they think of Donald Trump. Of course, he's a billionaire. Or they think of Elon Musk, also a billionaire. Or they think of Madonna or Tom Cruise, and those are at least millionaires. We mostly see the successful Americans, the famous ones, Taylor Swift and so on. We still know Robert De Niro, the actors. But the poor Americans, the ones who work 3 jobs and still can't make ends meet, we hardly see them at all. Yet there are 100 million of them, out of a total population of about 330 million.
Von Gesamtbevölkerung 330 Millionen.
Ich kenne sie zum Teil.
I know them partly because I visit the United States quite often and, of course, talk to people there. And I have to say, many in my circle voted for Donald Trump out of protest. But now, Donald Trump hasn't delivered on social or economic policy. Was that also a reason for the renewed attack on Iran?
Auch für den wiederholten Angriff auf den Iran?
So Donald Trump
has, of course, completely deceived those voters. That's the MAGA base, Make America Great Again. It's really a painful kind of betrayal, because he said he wouldn't start any new wars. That was actually one of his most important campaign promises. He said the United States shouldn't get dragged into this or that war. And when it came to the war in Ukraine, he criticized Joe Biden heavily and said, I would end that war in 24 hours. He didn't do that. And above all, in his first term, those 4 years, 2017 through 2020, he actually tried to overthrow the government in Venezuela and had Qasem Soleimani killed in Iraq. That means you can already see this idea of limited strikes there. But he didn't do anything as extreme as these current attacks on Iran. And I can understand the Americans who are saying, hey, you've betrayed everything we expected from you. You didn't end the war in Ukraine, and on top of that, you started a new one. And that's the key point here. Patrick, on the very first day of the war, February 28, 2026, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. About 20 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every day. 1 barrel holds 159 liters. The world's daily demand is 100 million barrels. So, 20 million barrels means about 20% that aren't getting through right now. Sure, Iran said that every now and then a Chinese ship can pass, or maybe someone else, a friend, can go through. But that's what led the oil price to jump from around $70 to over $100. Now, that doesn't mean Trump suddenly can't fly anymore. He couldn't care less, at least in the short term. But if we look at those 100 million poor citizens, for them, this becomes a real threat to their livelihood very quickly. Because when the fuel bill gets too high, they simply can't afford to drive to work anymore.
Und das ist nicht nur in den USA so. Also ich habe ein Beispiel von einem
And that's not just the
Fischer
case in the
in
United
Thailand, der hat
States.
gesagt, ich
I have an
fahre
example from a fisherman in Thailand who said, I don't go out anymore because the fuel I need to head out and catch fish costs more than what I can make selling them. Sure, I could go out 3 times, but after the 3rd day I'd be broke, so I just don't go anymore. And that really is the fault of Trump and Netanyahu. Did the two of them miscalculate? Absolutely. They gambled and lost. What I get the impression of is that David Barnea, who's the head of Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, played a key role in that.
Das ist der israelische Geheimdienst, der Estland-Geheimdienst. Es gibt noch den Shin Bet und andere, aber Israel hat...
There's also Shin Bet and others. But in my view, Israel sent David Barnea to Washington. There are reports about that in the New York Times. And David Barnea was in New York, and Benjamin Netanyahu was in New York. So we know that the head of Mossad and the prime minister, not in New York, they were in Washington at the White House. And they told Trump, look, the Iranian government is weak. We'll strike once and the whole thing will collapse. And then Mossad hacked all the cameras in Tehran. Those cameras send images over wireless networks, over Wi-Fi. They're not all connected by cables. Many of them are wireless.
Da ist nicht überall ein Kabel dran, sondern ist oft auch drahtlos. Und die haben sie gehackt. Und dann konnten sie aus Internen immer schauen.
They hacked them. And from then on, as insiders, they could always check where Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was. They used the Iranians' own cameras to track where the Iranians were. It's like what people do with smartphones. You use someone's own device to monitor them. And that's how they knew that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was in that room on February 28th in the presidential palace on Pastor Street in Tehran. Then they just flew in and fired a series of rockets into the place. That's an assassination attempt. Every government in the world should condemn that. Because if that, how should I put it, if that becomes the new normal, then God help us.
The targeted killing of a head of state, and yet Iran is holding back in this conflict. And that targeted killing has clearly failed. Why is that?
Also gescheitert würde ich jetzt nicht sagen. Ayatollah Ali...
I wouldn't say it failed exactly. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is dead. There was an attempt to trigger a regime change. That failed. But Ali is dead. He was 86, and now he's gone. And now Moshtaba, his son, is the new Ayatollah. People say, but he wasn't elected by the people. That's true. I'm not claiming Iran is a democracy, but you can't just bomb a country because it isn't one. That's not what international law says. There's a ban on the use of force between those 193 states. Except when a country has a bad government? No, that's not what it means.
Nein, das heißt es eben nicht. Es kann auch eine schlechte Regierung in einem Land sein.
There can be a bad government in a country, but that still doesn't justify bombing it. And Moshtaba Khamenei, just to be clear about this, he's the one the United States and Israel now have to negotiate with. Apparently, he's been injured, though no one knows for sure. He's definitely not appearing in public, but he's the one they have to talk to, because he was also hurt in that same room. Maybe seriously, I don't know. And all I can say is, they killed his father, they killed his mother, and they killed his wife. And now they have to negotiate with him.
Und mit dem müssen sie jetzt verhandeln. Also, ich denke, das wird schwierig.
I think that's going to be difficult. How would you describe the situation? Have we reached a point in the conflict where neither side can turn back?
Also mich dünkt die Lage einfach gefährlich.
I think the situation is simply dangerous because Iran, well, Trump and Netanyahu broke international law. That's the first thing. That's a fact. It's going to be recorded that way in the history books. That page is already written. Netanyahu also carried out the genocide in the Gaza Strip. That page is written too. So there's no good story to tell about Netanyahu. And then there's Trump betraying his own people. That page is already written as well.
Diese Seite ist auch schon geschrieben. Und dann glaube ich, dass man den Iran...
And I think people really haven't understood Iran properly. They said, oh, they can't do anything, they're not important, and so on. But this is a civilization that's thousands of years old. I still remember when I studied ancient history, it was clear the Persians were a major power. The wars against the Persians go way back, that's nothing new. And Iran has the power of geography. That's what interests me most. Iran can close the Strait of Hormuz. It's only about 30 kilometers wide. And if Iran says, no ship passes through here anymore, what can you do? You can say, we'll sail through anyway. But then those ships will come under fire.
Ja, aber dann fährst du zurück und sagst, ja nein, also
Yeah,
ich möchte hier
but then you head back and say, no, I don't want to get stuck in this 30-kilometer-wide strait. And if you were an American commander and someone told you, go clear the Strait of Hormuz, you'd have to destroy or disable every single Iranian missile. You'd have to take out all the drones, and that includes underwater drones, plus all the ones flying through the air. Then you'd have to clear every landmine before that passage could be considered safe again. In other words, you'd have to defeat Iran. And that's just not possible. So to me, that means this. The largest navy in the world is definitely the US Navy. In terms of warships and experience, no question about it. The United States is the empire.
Die USA sie sind das Imperium. Aber hier haben sie eine Schwierigkeit. Sie können nicht.
But here's where they've got a real problem. They can't even fight to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. And for me, that means I'm watching very closely. Actually, I check every day. Is the strait open? Who is it open for? Is it closed, and for whom? Then Trump went and set up a second blockade outside of it. But that doesn't help either. It just makes things even dumber. The idea should be to get it open again. And you know, Patrick, something that really strikes me, and that a lot of people are noticing now, is that Trump can't solve a problem that didn't even exist before. We didn't have any issue with the Strait of Hormuz on February 27th, 2026. Ships were going out, coming in, heading wherever they needed to go. They brought LNG to Germany, liquefied natural gas. After Germany, first under Scholz and then under Merz, made the absolutely huge mistake of cutting itself off from Russian oil and gas, the country's been getting poorer as a result. I'm completely in favor of Germany importing oil and gas from Russia again. We should just call Moscow and say, we're sorry, a lot went wrong. We behaved really badly, and we spoke badly about you, and we're sorry. Do you still have oil and gas for us? Because this idea of importing from Qatar, as if that's a stable region, that's clearly not working right now either.
Obviously, this war isn't about Iran's nuclear program. So what is it really about?
In my opinion, this definitely isn't about the nuclear program, because we already had the JCPOA. That was a perfectly designed system where the Iranians, the Israelis, the Americans, the British, the Russians, everyone sat down together. And then there was a plan. Just to explain that for people, there was a plan that made sure Iran couldn't build a nuclear bomb because the uranium wouldn't be enriched to that level. But still, they could have a nuclear power plant. We in Switzerland have nuclear power plants too. Every country should be allowed to have one. The French have a lot of nuclear power plants. Some countries don't have any, but I think there are about 440 nuclear power plants worldwide.
Es gibt weltweit etwa 440 Atomkraftwerke. Das ist die Situation. Es ist kein Verbrechen eines Landes, wenn die
That's the situation. It's not a crime for a country to want a nuclear power plant. It's a political decision. You can support it or oppose it. I know, of course, there are reasons against nuclear power, Fukushima, Chernobyl, and so on. But Iran has a nuclear power plant in Bushehr. And what I find absolutely crazy is that the Israelis and the Americans bombed targets just about 70 meters from that plant. If you blow up the reactor, you'd contaminate the entire Persian Gulf with radiation. That's just not acceptable. At some point, you have to tell the US and Israel, hey, come on, enough is enough. And this JCPOA, that was a plan Trump pulled out of.
Den hat Trump gekündigt. Den hat Trump gekündigt und darum geht es meiner Meinung nach nicht.
Trump canceled that agreement. And in my view, this whole issue isn't really about the nuclear program. I think it's actually about trying to break up and overthrow the Iranian government in order to take power. Just like in Venezuela, it wasn't about any kind of atomic bomb. Venezuela never wanted a bomb. Then Trump kidnapped Maduro on January 3rd, 2020. That was, of course, also a violation of the UN Charter's ban on the use of force. I've done a lot of research on US imperialism, and I can see that in 2020 they made, in a very short time, a series of major mistakes, serious ones, in my opinion, all aimed at taking power in another country by toppling its government.
Is this war against Iran going to continue? Is it about creating a greater Israel? About a strategy of dominance in the Near and Middle East? Is it about controlling the sea routes? Is it about oil and gas? Or is it a proxy war against China? Or maybe all of that together?
All in all, I think it's because there are different players involved. But yes, I do believe Netanyahu wants this greater Israel project that would stretch from the Nile to the Euphrates. And why do I think that? Because I can see it. He's also waging war against Lebanon at the same time. He wants to push up to the Litani River, basically bombing Lebanon along the way. In Gaza, he's not offering people any honest or fair solution, and the same goes for the West Bank. And in Syria, he's holding on to the Golan Heights. So when I look at Netanyahu's policies, it's clear to me, and that's historically undisputed, he's fighting a multi-front war. He's not only fighting Iran, he's also fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. He's taking action against the Palestinians in the West Bank. He also got involved in the war in Syria and in the effort to overthrow Assad. So all of that makes sense if you assume, hypothetically, that he just wants to expand Israel's territory. Somehow, whatever biblical reference he's relying on, I don't really know. But he's basically saying it needs to be a bit bigger. Of course, that causes tension. That doesn't go over well. Personally, I support the two-state solution, meaning there should be a state of Palestine. But the Gaza Strip is still a landscape of ruins. We're very far from that two-state solution. I also think the European Union's association agreement with Israel should be cancelled, because you can't just defend a genocide. I really don't understand that.
Man kann ja nicht einen Genozid einfach verteidigen. Ich verstehe das nicht. Das sollten wir nicht tun. Und da hat Merz ja auch gesagt, ja, nein, lasst sie.
We shouldn't do that. Merzy said, yeah, no, just let them go ahead. It's not really dangerous. But it is. It's very dangerous. So what I mean is, yes, this idea of Greater Israel does exist in my view. Of course, not everyone in Israel supports it, and certainly not all Jews. I have to say, there are some very smart Jewish voices in the US, like Jeffrey Sachs, who are among Netanyahu's strongest critics. I'd even say that Jews are actually his toughest critics. People like Norman Finkelstein, Jeffrey Sachs, or Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone. They're the real critics, absolutely.
Die sind die Kritiker wirklich. Das finden wir im deutschen Sprachraum gar nicht. Jetzt die zweite Dimension, die
we don't really have that in German at all. Now, the second point you mentioned, that it's a fight against the BRICS countries, or against China, or even against China's oil routes. Yes, that too. You know, at the same time, for multiple reasons, I do think Trump probably thought actually that might be a good idea. We topple Iran, and by doing that, we weaken the flow of energy to China because a huge amount of the oil and gas that passed through the Strait of Hormuz was going to China. And of course, the Chinese are a major challenger to the United States. You don't need Netanyahu for there to be problems. The British and the Americans, through the CIA and MI6, overthrew the government in Iran back in 1953. And in my view, that was clearly a fight over oil. Because at the time, there's a whole chapter about this here. Mossadegh, the elected prime minister, by the way, the only elected prime minister in the Arab world at that time, yes, a true Democrat, a genuine Democrat. It had nothing to do with atomic bombs or mullahs, nothing like that.
Aber der MI6 und der CIA haben die Regierung gestürzt.
But MI6 and the CIA overthrew the government, and they also carried out false flag operations. They created chaos, bomb attacks, whatever it took. They destabilized Tehran. Why? Because Mossadegh had told BP, British Petroleum, that yes, they were the ones who first discovered oil in Iran. That's true, the British did the drilling. But later, the Iranians said, well, it's still our country, and that's our oil, so we'd like to nationalize it. And then the government in Iran was overthrown. For me, that shows it's always, in the end, a struggle over these resources.
Für mich, es ist immer eben auch ein Kampf um diese Rohstoffe.
Und das bedeutet Öl, Gas.
And that means oil and gas aren't just raw materials, they're also resource guarantees for new loans. Would financial capitalism collapse on itself without access to new resources?
Sich zusammenfallen ohne den Zugriff auf neue Ressourcen.
Ja, wichtig ist ja vor allem, in welcher Währung die Sache
What really matters is the currency used for payment. If oil is always paid for in dollars, then we have what's called the petrodollar system, which you're familiar with. But just to make it clear for the listeners, the petrodollar means that every country buying oil has to hold US dollars. Because every country needs oil. Like us in Switzerland, we need oil, so we have to hold dollars, since we have to buy oil on the international markets. And that's basically a system the United States introduced back in the 1970s. At that time, President Nixon ended the gold standard. In 1971, he simply said, by the way, the dollar is no longer backed by gold. And that was also about debt, specifically the debt from the Vietnam War. Exactly.
Schulden, nämlich die Verschuldung durch den Vietnamkrieg.
Genau. Hat einfach die Regierung irgendwann, jede Regierung ist natürlich
At some point, every government has tried to say, well, I can just print my own money. Imagine you had a printing press at home. Or I had one. Maybe we wouldn't touch it the first week. The second week, we'd still think, better not. It says right on top, do not use, it's bad for the global financial system. But eventually, say by the fourth week, a friend would call and say, hey, could you print me 300? And maybe that friend needs surgery and his wife is sick too. Then you'd think, all right, I'll just print the 300. So I do understand why the United States, which really has the ability to print dollars, or even just create them on a computer out of nothing, finds that incredibly tempting.
Dass das eine große Versuchung ist. Man sagt immer so, ja, diese Versuchung, wie kann man das?
People always say, yeah, how can someone give in to that temptation so quickly? Well, it's a big temptation. I'm glad I don't have it. And you don't have it either. We can't print money, but the United States, as the center of power, the Fed, they can create money out of nothing. So here's how it was. From 1944 to 1971, we had the Bretton Woods system. Back then, the dollar was tied to gold at $35 an ounce. That was the exchange rate. It was a system of balanced exchange rates that were linked to each other. Fixed exchange rates. The Swiss franc was fixed, and the Deutsche Mark was fixed to the dollar. And then Nixon came along, as you said, during the Vietnam War, and said, unfortunately, we don't have enough gold anymore. He said it was temporary.
Seit 71. Und ich wurde ja 72 geboren.
Since 1971, and I was born in 1972. So basically, I've only ever known a world where money could just be invented. I mean, that's a pretty wild idea that you can just create money out of nothing. And then there was Kissinger, Henry Kissinger. He was the national security advisor to President Nixon. Nixon was a criminal. Trump is a criminal. Nixon was a criminal. I have no illusions about that. But Nixon said, we have to make sure people don't lose trust in the dollar. And that's when Henry Kissinger made a deal with the Saudis. You've got all that oil, and when you sell it, please sell it in dollars.
Wenn ihr das verkauft, verkauft's bitte in Dollar. Und das war der Petrodollar und der hat eigentlich so mehr oder weniger.
That was the petrodollar, and it's basically worked more or less up to now. But I see this attack on Iran, since you asked whether the financial flows are changing, and I actually see a big risk here, because of course the Saudis, the Iranians, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, all those Gulf states, they might eventually say what the Americans and the Israelis have started here, wasn't exactly the smartest move. I mean, just imagine you're in Qatar, and the Americans come in and use the Al Udeid military base, which they did. Yes, they did. And then they bomb Iran. Iran can't fire 10,000 kilometers all the way to the US. That's just too far.
Kilometer bis in die USA schießen. Das ist zu weit weg. Der Erdumfang ist 40.000, das ist die Kugel.
The Earth's circumference is 40,000. That's the whole sphere. Measured at the equator, it's 40,000 kilometers. So 10,000 is a quarter of that. And that's how far they'd have to shoot if they wanted to hit the United States, which means they can't reach it. And it's the same situation for Germany. There are American military bases there too. So the Iranians just said, fine, then we'll wipe out the military base in Qatar. And of course, the Qataris noticed that. They realized Iran can destroy American military bases. I was in Qatar once. I still remember that. I was there for a conference with other journalists. It was quite an interesting event. I gave a talk, and we also visited Al Jazeera, the TV station there in the Arab world. We were in the studio, talking with journalists. It was interesting. I liked it. But then I thought, all right, I'll grab a taxi and go to the Al Udeid airbase. So I asked the taxi driver, do you know where that is? He said yes. I went there all by myself. That's the American military base, and at the entrance, there are always a few US soldiers. I drove up and said, hello, sir, I'm from Switzerland. Can I see the military base? I'm a historian. They asked, do you have permission? I said, no, sir. And they replied, well, if you don't have permission, it's not possible, sir. I already knew I wouldn't be allowed in. I just wanted to see the base for myself. And now I'm reading about it in the newspapers.
Und jetzt lese ich in den Zeitungen darüber. Und das finde ich, ist eigentlich die.
And that, I think, is really the big danger, that in the end, these countries, well, in the end, Iran could, if it controls the Strait of Hormuz and sets up its little customs booth there, just say $1 per barrel. And then for a big tanker, 2 million barrels, that's what the supertankers carry. That would be $2 million per passage. And Patrick, as a Swiss, I can understand that. Back in the day, when people wanted to cross the Gotthard, the Swiss also said, road toll. That was our business here in Switzerland. So if you wanted to go from Germany to Italy with trade goods, you might have been the traveling merchant, and I would have been the Swiss farmer. I'd have said, well, Mr. Bob, you can cross the Gotthard, sure, but it's going to cost you.
Ja, Herr Barb, Sie können da schon über den Gotthard, aber das ist teuer.
Nein, die Golfstaaten spüren, wenn sie als
The Gulf states know that if they serve as a staging area for the United States against Iran, Iran will strike their infrastructure, server farms, buildings, transportation links, oil and gas production sites, and desalination plants. That means these countries would become uninhabitable. If air conditioning stops working in that kind of heat, if they can't produce enough drinking water, those states would become unlivable. That's an existential threat.
Dann werden diese Staaten unbewohnbar. Das ist eine existenzielle Bedrohung.
Absolut. Also, wenn der
Absolutely. I have no idea how the war with Iran is going to continue. In my opinion, they should just stop. That's what I think. Stop it. So Trump, stop, calm down, and maybe even apologize. You can go ahead and say, I won. He can tweet whatever he wants. I don't care.
Der Iran hat ja eine interessante Sache gemacht.
Iran did something pretty interesting. They reopened the Strait of Hormuz for a day, and by doing that, they basically gave Trump a way out, a door he could have used to step back. They could have said, we've won, the strait is open again. Well, sure, they can collect their tolls, no big deal, small compromises are part of the game. But the Americans didn't take that opportunity. They're continuing their so-called blockade. Why?
Ihre Pseudoblockade fort. Warum?
Also, ich weiß nicht, das ist wirklich für mich unerklärlich.
I really don't know. It's completely baffling to me. That would have been the opportunity. It always comes down to the question of how you get out of a situation like that without losing face. That's what it's about. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy said, I won because Khrushchev pulled his nuclear missiles out of Cuba. And Khrushchev back home said, I won because Kennedy pulled his missiles out of Turkey. And back then, The world was still isolated. The Soviets read their newspapers, the Americans read theirs. There was no internet in that sense.
Internet in dem Sinne gab's nicht. Es gab kein YouTube, es war nicht vernetzt.
There was no YouTube back then. Nothing was connected. There were no smartphones. People just thought, oh, we won. Great, let's move on. But now Trump also needs a story he can tell. Something like, I won. And like you said, there was an opportunity he should have taken, but he didn't. Instead, he posted a picture of himself as Jesus. You know, I keep wondering, how deep does the confusion go? And in my view, the confusion runs deep. I honestly feel that Trump and Netanyahu are, right now, the two most dangerous men on the planet.
Jeffrey Sachs,
the American star economist from Columbia University in New York. He's still teaching, still debating, travels a lot, writes a lot. He said, Trump has gone insane, a clinical case. That's how he described him. Now, Antonio Gramsci once pointed out that in times when the old social order is collapsing but the new one is still struggling to be born, such times give rise to monstrosities, to monsters. So is Donald Trump, and maybe even Friedrich Merz, one of those monsters?
möglicherweise auch Friedrich Merz ein solches Monster?
Also ich sage ja immer, alle gehören zur Menschheitsfamilie.
Well, I always say, everyone belongs to the human family. That's a tough exercise sometimes, right? Merz is also a member of the human family. A difficult case, though. A difficult case. Or take Strack Zimmerman. She said Iran is the plague spot of the world. I mean, come on. What kind of statement is that? What could someone say like that about Germany? There are about 90 million people living in Iran. You can't just say that's the plague. How can you label an entire people like that? Okay, I won't go down that road. What I wanted to say is, with that kind of devaluation, you always have to be careful. And that's why I say they're part of the human family too.
Da sage ich, die gehören zur Menschheitsfamilie. Auch Trump, auch Netanyahu, auch Strack Zimmermann, auch Merz.
Trump, Netanyahu, Strack Zimmerman, Merz, all Iranians, all Russians, all Ukrainians, all Germans, all Spaniards, and yes, all Swiss too. All 8 billion people belong to the human family. I just think what we really need to do much more is to actually follow international law. Because this idea of, let's just bomb all the bridges and all the schools in Iran, what's that supposed to achieve? Or we go and destroy the infrastructure, say the LNG terminals. Have you ever seen those LNG terminals? They're enormous. You're such a well-traveled man, you know all this. But most people have no idea how many pipes there are. I was in Vienna once. You know how it is. You go there, give a talk, and then head to the airport. Right along the highway, there's that big OMV refinery. You know the one? I was in Austria again last week, and on the way to the airport we drove past it. I said, look, that's the biggest facility in Austria. But in Qatar and the Emirates, they've got even bigger ones. And how would you defend something like that against a swarm of drones? If I were Iran, for example, I could send 100 drones. Maybe they shoot down 80, but 20 still get through. Or you send 50, they take out 48. If 2 of them hit, loaded with enough explosives, bang, everything's gone. Billions are wiped out in a single day. And that's why I say, yes, these men are dangerous, and we have to contradict them. That's how I'd put it. I wouldn't call them monsters, because then people get the feeling they have to be killed. I'd rather say they're dangerous, and we have to say we don't want this. We also have to say more clearly, we don't want a war with Russia. Most people in Germany don't want a war with Russia. They're saying, please, solve the situation in Ukraine like this. Ukraine should declare that it will never join NATO, that it will stay neutral, and that the territories conquered by Russia now belong to Russia. Then the matter is settled.
Dieser geistige Zerfall in den westlichen
This intellectual decline in Western countries, attacking a nation even though it should have been clear that it would defend itself and that this would, so to speak, backfire, doesn't that show a certain loss of reality? I think it does. When Western elites act this way, is that a reflection of the overall decline of the West? Are we watching a dying social order in its final throes?
kämpft hier eine sterbende Gesellschaftsordnung in ihren letzten Zügen?
Also es gibt natürlich verschiedene
Well,
Positionen, wenn ich
there
den
are, of
Westen
course,
jetzt mal
different
so definiere,
positions.
dass ich sage,
If
das
I
sind die
define the West for a
100
moment as the NATO
32
countries,
Staaten.
that's 32
Weltweit haben
states.
wir 193
Worldwide,
Staaten.
we
Jetzt,
have a
wenn wir
total of
diese 32,
193.
dann gehörte zu
So
diesen
let's take those
32
32.
Staaten die USA.
Among
Wenn
them
Trump
are the
da
United
fehlen würde,
States
haben wir ein
with Trump.
Riesenproblem.
And there we clearly have a
Zu diesen
huge problem.
32 gehörte
Germany
auch
is also one of those
Merz. Da
32
sehen wir, da
with
haben wir ein
Merz.
Riesenproblem.
And again, we have a
Merz
huge
hätte schon
problem.
lange
Merz should have called
eigentlich
Putin a long time ago and said,
Putin
come on,
anrufen müssen
we
und
need to
sagen,
find a
komm,
way to
also
calm
irgendwie
things
müssen
down
wir hier
here
die Sache
because we
beruhigen,
need
weil
your
wir brauchen
energy.
keine Energie, weil
Otherwise,
sonst
our
geht unsere
economy
Wirtschaft
will
kaputt.
collapse.
Das wäre eine
That would
ganz
have been a
normale
completely
Arbeit
normal thing to
gewesen,
do,
weil die
because
Aufgabe
Merz's
von
job
Merz
really
wäre
should be to
eigentlich
protect the
wirklich
people from harm.
sozusagen Schaden vom Volk abzuhalten, ja?
Darauf hat er einen Eid geschworen.
Ja, das wäre, und das ist
He
ja nicht
swore an
einfach
oath
nur,
to that.
kann man, wenn man
And that's
Zeit
not
hat,
just
sondern
a you can
das
do it
ist
if you
eine
have time kind of
Aufgabe.
thing.
Und
That's his duty.
darum, wenn du sagst, gibt's
So when you say there are
Probleme im
problems
Westen?
in the
Ja, hallo,
West,
es gibt riesige
well,
Probleme.
yes, of
Und
course
wir
there
haben
are
ja auch
huge
jetzt
problems.
diese
But we've
Position
also
des
seen the
Pedro
position
Sanchez
Pedro
gesehen.
Sanchez
Das
has
ist
taken,
wirklich
and that's
die
now really
spanische
the Spanish
Position, wo ich
position.
sage,
And I'd
also
say
die
the
Europäer, sie
Europeans
sind
may be
vielleicht
slow, but some of them are starting to
langsam,
realize
aber
that things
einige
can't go
merken
on like
schon,
this.
dass es so
What I'm
nicht
wondering
geht.
now is,
Und mich
what's going to
interessiert
happen
jetzt,
over the
was
next 10
passiert in den
years?
nächsten 10 Jahren?
Will the
Werden die
Europeans just
Europäer
keep blindly
sozusagen
following American
weiterhin
imperialism?
blind dem
I mean,
amerikanischen
the Danes
Imperialismus
certainly don't
folgen?
want Trump to buy, bomb, or
Ich
conquer
meine, die
Greenland,
Dänen wollen
or
ja
whatever
nicht,
else he
dass
might have
man
in mind.
Grönland kauft oder bombardiert oder erobert oder was auch immer. Also ich finde, die NATO, diese 32 Staaten sind in einer tiefen Krise.
I think
Und
NATO,
ich glaube,
those
es könnte
32
tatsächlich
countries,
auch
are in a
so
deep
kommen,
crisis.
dass
And I
dort
believe
etwas
it's actually
Neues entsteht.
possible
Und
that
da bin
something
ich jetzt mal
completely new
hoffnungsvoll
could
und
emerge
sage,
from this.
es könnte ja auch so
So I'm
sein, dass
choosing
wir
to be
sagen,
hopeful and
wir
say,
verabschieden uns
maybe we'll decide to move
vom
away from
amerikanischen
American imperialism.
Würde für Deutschland
For
bedeuten,
Germany, that would mean leaving
NATO.
NATO. It
Würde
would
für
mean
Deutschland
saying that all
bedeuten, dass man sagt,
38,000
alle
US soldiers should go
38.000
home,
US-Soldaten
politely asked to go home.
sollen nach Hause gehen,
And that could
freundlich
happen. I
gebeten,
don't know how things will
nach
develop in the
Hause zu
Persian
gehen.
Gulf,
Und das könnte,
but it's
ja,
quite possible
ich
that
weiß es
Kuwait,
nicht, wie
the
sich es am
Emirates,
Persischen
Qatar,
Golf
and
entwickelt, aber
Bahrain
es
might
könnte
no
durchaus
longer
sein, dass
reopen the
Kuwait
American
und
military
Emirate
bases there.
und Katar und Bahrain die amerikanischen Militärstützpunkte nicht mehr eröffnen. Also das werden wir, das ist jetzt Spekulation, ich weiß es nicht, aber ich weiß einfach, dass
That's
die Iraner
speculation.
darauf
I don't
drängen,
know for sure.
dass
But I
alle
do know that the
amerikanischen
Iranians are
Militärstützpunkte
pushing for
geschlossen
all
werden
American
sollen.
military
Wenn das
bases
so
in the
ist,
Gulf
ist
to
es
be
für mich im
closed.
Rahmen von der
If that's the
Studie des
case,
amerikanischen
then to me,
Imperialismus ein
within the
Moment,
framework of studying
wo das
American imperialism,
Imperium sich
it's a moment
überdehnt
when the
hat
empire has
und dann
overextended itself
Stützpunkte
and now
schließen
has to
muss
shut down
und das
bases.
Imperium sich auch zu
It's also a
stark
moment when
verschuldet
the
hat,
empire has taken on too much
was
debt,
offensichtlich der
which
Fall
is
ist,
clearly the
und
case,
wo das
and when it can
Imperium
no
in
longer
der
persuade
öffentlichen
people through its
Kommunikation nicht
public
mehr
messaging.
überzeugen kann. Ja, wer
Who
glaubt
still
noch einem
believes
Trump?
Trump? Who sees him as a
Wer nimmt
wise leader?
wer nimmt ihnen
The Chinese
seine,
certainly
seinen
don't, the
weisen
Russians
Führer
don't,
da?
the Brazilians don't,
Die
the
Chinesen
Spaniards
sicher nicht,
don't,
die Russen
and
auch
I'd
nicht,
say
die
probably not the
Brasilianer auch
Saudis
nicht, die
either.
Spanier auch nicht. Und ich würde glauben, die Saudis auch nicht.
Das ist die Hypothese des französischen Historikers Emmanuel
That's the
Todd.
hypothesis of the French historian Emmanuel Todd, who says the Americans will gradually lose their vassals. Right now, new geopolitical claims are being staked out, drawing on the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, where the Americans are basically saying, we're organizing our own backyard, which includes Europe, and the others can keep their own claims.
Zu dem auch Europa gehört, und die anderen können ihren Claim behalten.
Also so wie ich die Monroe-Doktrin
Well,
verstanden
the way I
habe,
understood the Monroe Doctrine, it was pretty straightforward. The United States is on the other side of the Atlantic, and the Spaniards, the British, and the French, the three classic European colonial powers, aren't supposed to go there. They're not supposed to be in Cuba, not in Venezuela, not in Brazil. They're not supposed to be in Mexico either. And that was really the idea behind the Monroe Doctrine. Europeans, please stay on your side of the Atlantic.
Bleibt bitte auf eurer Seite des Atlantiks.
That led to the Americans kicking the Spaniards out of Cuba.
Genau, 1898 haben sie sie rausgeschmissen und die Kubaner haben dann...
Right? In 1898, they kicked them out, and at first the Cubans were happy. They thought, these are the liberators, now we're free. But then they realized, actually, these were the new masters, and the Americans went on to take over the Philippines as a colonial power, and so on. So in my view, the Monroe Doctrine was basically a message to the Europeans. Step aside, we want to colonize or control this whole region ourselves. And now, I really think we've reached a point where we have to deal seriously with the phenomenon of US imperialism. My advice to Europeans is this: under no circumstances should we blindly follow the United States into all these wars. You know, when Clinton bombed Serbia back in 1999, the French were in on it. The Germans joined the bombing too. That was still under Gerhard Schroeder and Joschka Fischer. The Spanish took part. The Danes, the Norwegians, the Turks were bombing, the Italians as well. The Americans said we're at war, and all the NATO countries went along. I don't really see that happening anymore. I mean, we've been more critical lately. But if there's one thing I'd actually give him credit for, it's that he said, I'm not going to fight to secure the Strait of Hormuz. We'll see how that plays out. Time will tell. But in any case, the German military really has no role there. It doesn't need to fight to secure the Strait of Hormuz, and it couldn't do it anyway. But as you said, the pieces are being reshuffled. The playing field now includes Eurasia. And I'd suggest that Europe, and Germany too, should maintain peaceful relations with China and Russia. You know, importing oil and gas from Russia to Germany, exporting German products to China, and buying Chinese goods in Germany. That's how prosperity, wealth, and security could be possible over the next 50 or even 100 years. What's not a good idea is saying, we don't want anything to do with China, they're bad. Or, we don't want oil or gas from Russia, they're bad. Then we just tie ourselves completely to Washington. And if they go over the cliff, we'll jump right after them. That's simply not smart policy.
This loyalty to the United States, the loyalty of the European elites, does that have to do with the fact that these elites have tied their careers to transatlantic organizations?
I think, in part, yes. These are, of course, networks. And maybe, from 1945 to 1991, that approach even worked, where people said, I'll just repeat whatever the American president says, and that'll make me richer. That might have been the plan, not a complicated one. But then people hardly criticized the Vietnam War. Instead, they said things like, well, it's important that you fight communism over there, and so on. They probably didn't criticize the coup in Iran in 1953 either, because they said, well, the Iranians are dangerous, or something like that. A lot of things were just waved through and accepted. Libya was already bombed back in '86, right? And back then people said, well, that's just how it has to be, and so on. But now we're in a completely new situation. And I think Europeans are starting to realize that things just can't go on like this. I mean, this idea of, we'll send Leopard tanks to Ukraine, and then Zelensky drives straight through to Moscow and defeats Putin. That was absolutely unrealistic from the start. Merz said Putin has no chance of winning this war. Yeah, that's what Merz says, but he's wrong. Putin will definitely insist, as he's always said, that Ukraine must not join NATO. And if NATO ends up losing the war in Ukraine, then we really need to take a hard look at things and ask ourselves, wouldn't it be better if we first of all dissolved NATO? That would be my suggestion. Or if Germany simply left NATO. We could call Russia and say, hey, let's rebuild a pan-European system within the framework of the OSCE or some other structure. Because we do need some kind of security infrastructure in Europe, where Germany, France, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, and Russia can all just say to each other, look, let's not kill each other. That's actually always the best situation. Because in Europe, we've already fought so many wars against each other. There's no need now to dissolve NATO and replay those old wars all over again. That would destroy everything. But I think, my vision, or really my hope as a peace researcher, is that we'll reach a point in Europe where we can say, this war in Ukraine was a huge mistake. It was provoked by NATO's eastward expansion. And in the end, it was triggered by the coup on the Maidan on February 20th, 2014. After that came the civil war, which you've studied in great detail.
dann kam der Bürgerkrieg, den du sehr genau untersucht hast. Dann kam die russische Invasion, die illegal war, aber eben provoziert. Und
Then came the Russian
jetzt sind wir in
invasion.
diese
Illegal, yes,
Situation im
but provoked.
2026.
And now,
Und jetzt
here we
bleiben
are
wir
in
dabei. Aber das
2026.
war die
So how do we
Idee
move
vom
forward
März,
from here?
absolute
The idea
Konfrontation
from
mit Russland
MERS,
hat
this
sich
notion
sehr
of total
strategisch
confrontation with
gewendet.
Russia, I
Man
think
muss
that's
ja immer
completely
gleich
wrong.
die Karten anschauen und
Strategically, it's
sagen, wir
exactly the
wo
wrong
liegt denn
approach.
Europa?
You
Wo
always
liegt
have to
denn
look at the
Deutschland?
map and
Wo
ask,
liegt
where is
Russland?
Europe?
Wo
Where is
sind die
Germany?
Rohstoffe?
Where
Mit
is
wem
Russia?
können wir
And
Handel
where are the
treiben?
resources? Who can we
Und
trade with?
da bin ich
And I
wirklich
really
der
believe that
Meinung,
German
das
politics,
heute ist
the
auch von der
parliament
deutschen
included,
Politik,
needs
vom
more
Parlament
courage
her
to
braucht
say,
es mehr Mut,
the
dass man
government
sagt,
is wrong on
die,
this.
die
We should make
Regierung
peace with
sagt,
Russia.
wir sollten Frieden mit Russland schließen. Da braucht es tatsächlich auch eine Entschuldigung.
There really
Also
does
wenig
need to be an
Worten, oder? Wo
apology.
man dann sagt,
Kind of
okay,
like what
jetzt
Willy Brandt did,
ist nicht
where you
gerade
just
die
say,
Leistung,
okay,
tut
that
uns
didn't go
leid,
so
irgendwie
well.
so, weißt du?
We're
Also
sorry. Something like that.
ich habe immer noch die
I
Hoffnung
still
und
haven't given up
dass
hope
die
that the
Achse
Berlin-Moscow
Berlin-Moskau
axis can heal again.
wieder heilen kann.
Right
Im
now
Moment
it's
ist sie
broken,
gebrochen,
but
aber
like a
wie
broken
ein
leg,
Bein, das gebrochen
you
ist,
know
dann
it
weißt
can
du, das
heal.
kann heilen.
It just needs to be
Es muss
relieved of
aber
pressure. When your leg's broken,
werden, wenn
you
das
can't
Bein
just keep
gebrochen ist,
jumping around on
musst
it.
du damit
You have to
nicht
take
noch
the weight
irgendwie
off, keep it still,
rumbringen,
and then
sondern
it
du
can
musst
grow
zuerst
back together.
entlasten, ruhig halten und dann kann das wieder zusammenwachsen. Und dann kann man Freundschaftstreffen machen,
And
man
then
kann sich
you can have
entschuldigen,
friendship
das ist
meetings, you can
wichtig, man kann
apologize.
gemeinsam
That's
helfen.
important.
So wie
You can do things
Ping-Pong-Diplomatie
together,
zwischen den
like the
Chinesen und
ping-pong
den
diplomacy
Amerikanern,
between the
oder man kann
Chinese and the
Fußballspiele
Americans.
machen, also ich weiß
You
nicht,
could
was
organize
ich alles
soccer
anbieten
matches.
würde.
I don't even know what all I'd
Schachturniere
suggest,
mit
or
den
chess
Russen
tournaments with the
oder
Russians.
da
There
gibt
are
es viele
lots of
Ideen,
ideas.
weil ich
Because
glaube, die
I believe the
Russen
Russians actually have a real
haben
affection
auch
for
eine
Europe.
Liebe eigentlich
After all, up to the Ural Mountains,
Europa, weil bis
Russia
zum
is part of
Ural
Europe.
liegt ja Russland in
So why
Europa.
should we tell
Und warum
Moscow for
sollten
the
wir dem
next
für die
30 or
nächsten
50
30
years,
oder 50
sell all your
Jahre
oil and
uns
gas to the Chinese?
sagen, verkauft
I
alles
just
Öl
don't
und
see
Gas
that.
den Chinesen?
Sure, you
Ich
can
sehe das
trade with the
nicht. Ich finde
Chinese.
das, ja, wir
Russia's big
könnten
enough for
natürlich
that.
Handel treiben mit den Chinesen. Russland ist groß genug. Aber es wäre für uns in der Schweiz, für alle in Österreich
But
und
for
für
us
alle
in
in
Switzerland,
Deutschland
and for everyone in
ist es
Austria and
wichtig,
Germany,
dass wir
it's
auch mit
really
Russland
important that we can
friedlich
trade
Handel
peacefully
treiben
with
und
Russia and
günstige
buy
Rohstoffe,
affordable
was
raw
man einkauft.
materials
Das
from
ist für
there.
mich einfach so
To
klar.
me, that's
Das
just
wird nicht
obvious.
gelingen.
It
Das
simply
vielleicht
has
haben
to
wir doch
work.
Diplomaten.
That's what we have
Die
diplomats
wurden
for.
ja
They were
ausgebildet für
trained
das.
for
Die
exactly
sollen
that.
hinfahren und
They
sagen,
should go there and say, ideally in
das, was ich
Russian,
noch
if they
Russisch kann,
can, which I
was ich
can't,
nicht kann. Und
say,
sagen,
folks,
Leute,
these have been difficult times, and we
schwierige
haven't
Zeiten,
always
die
treated you
vergangen
kindly.
sind und
And we don't
die
have to
nicht immer
completely
freundlich
abandon the
behandelt.
positions we held before.
Man muss auch nicht die Position absolut kassieren, die man früher gehabt hat. Man kann immer noch sagen, ja, also wir sehen trotzdem die
We can
Invasion
still
in
say
die
that we see
Ukraine
the
als
invasion of
eingestoßen
Ukraine
und das
as a
Völkermord.
violation of
Wir sehen
international
die
law.
NATO-Osterweiterung, der
But we
wir
also see that
zugestimmt
NATO's
haben,
eastward
aber da musste
expansion, which we
jedes Land
agreed to,
zustimmen.
every country has to agree
War
to
auch
it,
nicht
wasn't a
gut.
good
Und
thing either.
jetzt mit den
And now with
USA
the United
sehen wir, die
States,
haben ja
we
auch
see
den
that they
Kurs
were the
gemacht.
ones who
Also
carried out the coup.
wir sind im Moment daran, die
Right now,
Dinge
we're in the
neu zu
process of
beurteilen.
reassessing
Wärt
things.
ihr bereit,
Would you be open to
dass
us holding a friendship chess tournament?
ein Freundschaftsschach
And if we do that, you could even win. If we do it, would you then be willing to reopen the Nord Stream pipelines and start supplying us with affordable natural gas again? Because we need it. You can't just say, we'll give up on energy. What kind of plan would that even be?
sagen, wir verzichten auf Energie. Was soll denn das für ein Plan sein?
Der Historiker Dr. Daniele Ganser.
The historian Dr. Daniele Ganser says that Russia's attack on Ukraine was illegal, but that NATO provoked it through its eastward expansion and also through the coup on the Maidan. Now he says relations with Russia need to be restored, especially energy relations, and NATO should be dissolved. Thank you for this conversation. Here at Against the Current, we present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden.
Welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen.